Every year for over 3 decades, the United Nations General Assembly has voted on a single resolution: end the United States economic embargo on Cuba. In 2025, the vote was 165 countries in favor, 7 against. The embargo is still there. In fact, in January 2026, the United States government made it stronger. In February 1962, President Kennedy formalized a near-total trade embargo on Cuba. 3 years after Fidel Castro's revolution overthrew the U.S.-backed government of Fulgencio Batista, and less than a year after Castro declared the revolution socialist. It remains 6 decades later the longest-running economic embargo in modern history. The two governments don't even agree on what to call it. Washington's own documents call it sanctions, a policy response to specific actions by Cuba's government. Havana's own documents call it el bloqueo, the blockade, a single word that reframes 6 decades of policy as an act of continuous economic warfare, not a series of targeted responses. 1959, Castro's revolution takes Havana. 1960, Cuba nationalizes U.S.-owned businesses. The U.S. cuts Cuba's sugar import quota. 1961, Castro declares the revolution socialist. CIA-backed Cuban exiles are defeated at the Bay of Pigs. February 1962, the U.S. embargo begins. October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brings the two superpowers to the edge of nuclear war over Soviet missiles on the island. It ends with a secret U.S. pledge never to invade Cuba. 1966, the US-Cuban Adjustment Act gives Cuban arrivals an immigration path no other nationality receives. 1980, over 125,000 Cubans leave for the U.S. in the Mariel boat lift. 1996, the Helms-Burton Act writes the embargo into U.S. law, extending it to foreign companies that deal with Cuba. 2014 to 2016, the Obama administration reopens embassies and becomes the first sitting U.S. president to visit Cuba since 1928. 2017, the Trump administration reverses the thaw amid unexplained illnesses among U.S. diplomats in Havana. January 2021, Cuba is added to the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. July 2021, Cuba sees its largest anti-government protests in decades. January 2025, the outgoing Biden administration removes Cuba from the terrorism list. January 2026, the Trump administration declares a national emergency over Cuba and reimposes sweeping new sanctions. Cuba's foreign ministry, addressing the UN General Assembly in July 2026, described the embargo not as a trade policy, but as what Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez called a multidimensional unconventional war, nearly 7 decades old and, in his words, more ruthless in the 7 months before that speech than at almost any point before. Cuba's own figures put the economic damage at over $8 billion for the 12 months ending February 2026 alone. In this frame, the revolution's legitimacy was never really about Castro. It was about ending a pre-1959 order in which Cuba's economy and much of its politics ran through Washington and U.S. corporations first. Cuba's government points to its literacy campaigns and universal healthcare system as proof the revolution delivered on its founding promises, and treats the embargo's persistence across 11 different U.S. presidents as evidence that Washington's real objection was never about any specific Cuban policy. It was, and remains, about the revolution's independence itself. The U.S. State Department's own current position doesn't describe this as a legacy Cold War dispute. It describes Cuba's government, in its own 2026 language, as a regime that has waged a continuous campaign of political, ideological, and institutional warfare against the United States for nearly 7 decades, hosting intelligence facilities and serving as what State Department statements call an outpost for U.S. adversaries in the hemisphere. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's own framing in 2026 was specific: that Cuba's government has weaponized its energy sector as a tool of domestic repression, and that new sanctions target the regime's military instrumentalities and elites rather than the Cuban population directly. In this frame, the embargo isn't the origin of Cuba's economic hardship. The Cuban government's own management of the economy and its continued human rights record are. 165 countries to 7 year after year for over 3 decades is about as close to a unanimous position as the community of nations ever reaches on anything, and it has never once required a single change in U.S. policy. It's the same shape this series has already seen, an overwhelming vote with no army behind it. But there's a second, quieter asymmetry, and it belongs entirely to Washington. Cuba's government didn't change in any fundamental way. Between January 2025 and January 2026, U.S. policy toward it changed twice in that window. Off the terrorism list under one administration, then a national emergency, and new sanctions under the next. Whatever is actually driving American Cuba policy at any given moment, it isn't only what's happening in Havana. This series keeps finding new ways to ask the same question: what actually changes anything? A referendum didn't for Kurdistan. A legal clause outlived the war it was written for in Beijing. A single court ruling contained 2 different answers, and both sides kept both. Here, the missing piece isn't ambiguity, it's leverage. The rest of the world has expressed its view on this dispute about as clearly and consistently as it's possible to express anything. And the one government whose vote actually matters has simply never needed the other's agreement to keep its policy exactly where it wants it. Maybe that's the addition this episode makes to the list. Consensus and power are not the same currency, and this dispute may be the clearest demonstration in the whole series of just how little one buys of the other. A 60-plus year embargo, a UN vote that repeats itself every year like a formality nobody expects to change anything, and a policy that swung twice in 12 months without the island it targets changing at all. Next time, we head to the Caucasus, where a 5-day war in August 2008 is remembered by one side as defending its own soldiers, and by the other as the moment a neighbor's tanks crossed an internationally recognized border, and where the exact playbook used there would resurface, unmistakably, 14 years later.